Hello everyone, this is Sumit Bose and I am from the Bodhi Academy. Today we are going to discuss on the chapter print culture and modern world. We have divided the chapters into chapter into two parts. So today we are going to discuss with part 1. It is difficult for us to imagine a world without printed matter. We find evidence of print everywhere around us, where in books, journals, newspapers, prints of famous paintings, and also everyday things in these, like their theater programs, official circulars, calendars, diaries, advertisements, cinema posters, and street corners. We read printed literature and see printed images, follow the news through newspapers, and track public debates that appear in print. We take for granted this world of print and often forget that there was a time before print. We may not realize that print itself has a history which has in fact shaped our contemporary world. So, what is this history? So, print has become an essential part of our everyday life, right? So, what is this history? How it all started? When did printed literature begin to circulate? How it has helped create the modern world? In this chapter, we will look at the development of print from its beginnings of East Asia to its expansion in Europe and in India. We will understand the impact of spread of technology and consider how social lives and cultures change with the coming of print. The first printed books. The earliest kind of print technology was developed in China, Japan, and Korea. This was a system of hand printing. From AD 594 onwards, books in China were printed by rubbing paper, also invented there, against the inked surface of wood blocks, as both sides of the thin porous sheet could not be printed. The traditional Chinese accordion book was folded and stitched at the side. Calligraphy. This is important. Superbly skilled craftsmen could duplicate with remarkable accuracy with the beauty of calligraphy. What is calligraphy? This is calligraphy. The imperial state in China was for a very long time the major producer of printed material. China possessed a huge bureaucratic system which recruited its personnel through civil service examinations. Textbooks of this examination were printed in vast numbers under the sponsorship of the imperial state. From the 16th century, the number of examination candidates went up and increased the volume of print. By the 17th century, as armor culture bloomed in China, the uses of print diversified. Print was no longer used just by scholar officials. Merchants used print in their everyday life. as they collected trade information. Reading increasingly became a leisure activity. The new readership preferred fictional narratives, poetry, autobiographies, anthologies of literary masterpieces, and romantic plays. Rich women began to read, and many women began publishing their poetry and plays. Wives of scholar officials published their works, and courtesans wrote about their lives. This new reading culture was accompanied by a new technology. Western printing techniques and mechanical presses were imported in the 19th century as Western powers established their outposts in China. Shanghai became the hub of the new print culture, centering to Western style schools. From hand printing, there was now a gradual shift to mechanical printing. Print in Japan. Buddhist missionaries from China introduced hand printing technology into Japan around AD 768 to 770. The oldest Japanese book printed in AD 868, the Diamond Sutra, containing 6 sheets and text and woodcut illustrations. Pictures were printed on textiles. A page from the Diamond Sutra. This. Playing cards and paper money. In medieval Japan, poets and prose writers were regularly published and books were cheap and abundant. Printing of visual material led to interesting publishing practices. In the late 18th century, in the flourishing urban circles at Edo, later known as Tokyo, illustrated collections of paintings depicted an elegant urban culture involving artists, courtesans, and tea house gatherings. Libraries and bookstores were packed with hand-printed material of various types, books on women, musical instruments, calculations, tea ceremony, flower arrangement, proper etiquette, cooking at famous places. Print comes to Europe. Now, print comes to Europe. For centuries, silk and spices from China flowed into Europe through the Silk Route. In the 11th century, Chinese paper reached Europe via the same route. Paper made possible the production of manuscripts carefully written by scribes. Then, in 1295, Marco Polo, a great explorer, returned to Italy after many years of exploration in China. As you have read above, China already had the technology of woodblock printing. Marco Polo brought this knowledge back with him. Now Italians began producing books with wood blocks, and soon the technology spread to other parts of Europe. Luxury editions were still handwritten on very expensive vellum. It is a vellum, a parchment made from the skin of animals. Important. Short question. Meant for aristocrat circles and rich monastic libraries which scoffed at printed books as cheap vulgarities. Merchants and students in the universities towns brought the cheaper printed copies. As the demand for books increased, booksellers all over Europe began exporting books to many different countries. Book fairs were held at different places. Production of handwritten manuscripts was also organized in new ways to meet the expanded demand. Scribes or skilled handwriters were no longer solely employed by wealthy or influential patrons, but increasingly by booksellers as well. More than 50 scribes were often worked for one bookseller. But the production of handwritten manuscripts could not satisfy the ever-increasing demand for books. Copying was an expensive, laborious, and time-consuming business. Manuscripts were fragile, awkward to handle, and could not be carried around or read easily. Their circulation therefore remained limited. With the growing demand for books, woodblock printing gradually became more and more popular. By the early 15th century, woodblocks were being widely used in Europe to print textiles, playing cards, and religious pictures with simple, brief text. There was a there was clearly a great need for even quicker and cheaper reproduction text. This could only be with the invention of new print technology. The breakthrough occurred at Strasbourg, Germany, where Johann Gutenberg developed the first printing press in 14th century. So, after Johannes Gutenberg invented the first printing press, printing became cheaper. Gutenberg and his printing press. Gutenberg was the son of a merchant and grew up on a large agricultural estate. From his childhood, he had seen wine and olive presses. Subsequently, he learned the art of polishing stones, became a master goldsmith, and also acquired the expertise to create lead molds used for making trinkets. Drawing on his knowledge, Gutenberg adapted existing technology to design his innovation. The olive press provided the model for printing press, and molds were used for casting the metal types of letters of the alphabets. By 1448, Gutenberg perfected the system. The first book he printed was the Bible. About 180 copies were printed, and it took 3 years to produce them. By the standards of the time, this was first fast production. The new technology did not entirely displace the existing art of producing books by hand. In fact, printing books at first closely resembled the written manuscripts in appearance and layout. The metal letters imitated the ornamental handwritten styles. Borders were illuminated by hand with foliage and other patterns, and illustrations were painted. In the books printed for the rich, space for decoration was kept blank on the printed page. Each purchaser could choose the design and decide on the painting school that would do the illustrations. In the 100 years between 1450 and 1550, printing presses were set up in most countries of Europe. Printers from Germany traveled to other countries seeking work and helping start new presses. As the number of printing presses grew, book production boomed. The second half of the 5th century saw 20 million copies of printed books from flooding the markets in Europe. The number went up to 16th century, about 200 million copies. The shift from hand printing to mechanical printing led to the print revolution. This is important. Compositor, the person who composes text. These two are very important. The print revolution and its impact. A new reading public. With the printing press, a new reading public emerged. Printing reduced the cost of books. The time and labor required to produce each book came down, and multiple copies could be produced with greater ease. Books flooded the market, reaching out to an ever-growing readership. Access to books created a new culture of reading. Earlier, reading was restricted to the elites. Common people lived in a world of oral culture. They heard sacred texts read out, ballads recited, and folk tales narrated. Knowledge was transferred orally. So, in those days, only rich people could afford to buy books. But now, when the printing press was invented, buying books became easy, okay, cheaper. Price became cheap as the books could reach out to wider sections of people. If earlier there was a hearing public, now reading public came into the being. But the transition was not so simple. Books could be read only by literate, and the rates of literacy in most European countries were very low till the 20th century. How then could publishers persuade the common people to welcome the printed book? To do this, they had to keep in mind the wider reach of the printed book. Even those who did not read could certainly enjoy listening to books being read out. So printers began publishing popular ballads and folk tales. Such books would be profusely illustrated with pictures. These were then sung and recited at gatherings in village, in taverns and towns. So oral culture became popular because most of the Europeans did not knew how to read. Okay, so they knew these orally. The book publishers solved this problem. Oral culture thus entered print, and printed material was orally transmitted. The line that separated the oral and reading cultures became blurred at the hearing, and the hearing public and the reading public became intermingled. Ballad history. Print created the possibility of wide circulation of ideas and introduced a new world of debate and discussion. Even those who disagreed with established authorities could now print and circulate their ideas. Through the printed message, they could persuade people to think differently and move them to action. This had significance in different spheres of life. Not everyone welcomed the printed book, and those who did also had fears about it. Many were apprehensive of the effects that the easier access to the printed word and wider circulation of books could have on people's mind. It was feared that if there was no control over what was printed and read, then rebellious and irregular thoughts might spread. If that happened, the authority of valuable literature would be destroyed, expressed by religious authorities and monarchs, as well as many writers and artists. This anxiety was the basis of widespread criticism and new printed literature that he had begun to circulate. Let us consider the implication of this in one sphere of life, early modern Europe, namely religion. In 1517, the religious reformer Martin Luther wrote 95 theses criticizing many of the practices rituals of Roman Catholic Church. A printed copy of this was posted on a church door in Wittenberg. It challenged the church to debate his ideas. Luther's writings were immediately reproduced in vast numbers and read widely. This led to the division within the church that to the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Luther's translation of New Testament sold 5,000 copies within a few weeks, and second edition was appeared within 3 months. Deeply grateful to print, Luther said, "Printing is the ultimate gift of God and the greatest one. Several scholars, in fact, think that print brought about a new intellectual atmosphere and helped spread the new ideas that led to Reformation. Protestant Reformation. A 16th century movement to reform the Catholic Church dominated by Rome. Martin Luther was the one of the main Protestant reformers. Several traditions of anti-Catholic Christianity developed out. So this is Protestant Reformation. This is important. Print and dissent. Print and popular religious literature stimulated many distinctive individual interpretations of faith even among little educated working people. In the 16th century, Minocchio, a miller in Italy, began to read books that were available in his locality. He reinterpreted the message of the Bible and formulated a view of God and creation that enraged the Roman Catholic Church. When the Roman Church began Inquisition to repress heretical ideas, Minocchio was hauled up twice and ultimately executed. The Roman Church, troubled by such effects of popular readings and questionings of faith, imposed severe controls over publishers and booksellers and began to maintain an index of prohibited books from 1558. Inquisition, former Roman Catholic code for identifying publishing heretics. Seditious, action with speech writing that was seen opposing the government. The reading mania. Through the 17th and 18th centuries, literacy rates went up in most parts of Europe. Churches of different denominations set up schools in villages carrying literacy to peasants and artisans. By the end of the 18th century, in some parts of Europe, literacy rates were as high as 60 to 80%. As literacy and schools spread in European countries, there was a virtual reading mania. People wanted books to read, and printers produced books in ever increasing numbers. New forms of popular literature appeared in print, targeting new audiences. Booksellers employed peddlers who roamed around the villages carrying little books for sale. There were almanacs or ritual calendars along with the ballads and folktales. But the other form of reading matter largely on for entertainment began to reach ordinary readers well in England. In England, penny cheap books were carried by the petty peddlers known as cheapmen and sold for a penny so that even the poor could buy them. In France, were the bibliothèques bleues, which were low-priced small books printed on poor quality paper and bound in cheap blue covers. There were the romances printed 4 to 6 pages and more substantial histories, which were stories about the past. Books were the various sizes, serving many different purposes and interests. The periodical press developed from the early 18th century. combining information about current affairs with the entertainment. Newspapers and journals carried information about wars and trade, as well as news of developments in places. Similarly, the ideas of scientists and philosophers now became more accessible to the common people. Ancient and medieval scientific texts were compiled and published, and maps and scientific diagrams were widely printed. When scientists like Isaac Newton began to publish their discoveries, they could influence a much wider circle of scientifically minded readers. The writings of thinkers such as Thomas Paine, Voltaire, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau were also widely printed and read. Thus, their ideas about science, reason, and rationality found their way into popular literature. Tremble before tyrants. By the mid 18th century, there was a common conviction that books were means of spreading progress and enlightenment. Many believed that books could change the world, liberate society from despotism and tyranny, and herald a time when reason and intellect would rule. Louis Sebastien Mercier, a novelist in 18th century France, declared, "The printing press is the most powerful engine of progress and public opinion in the force that will sweep despotism away." In many Mercier's novels, the heroes are transformed acts of reading. They devour books, are lost in the world books create, and become enlightened in the process. Convinced of the power of print in bringing enlightenment and destroying the basis of despotism, Mercier proclaimed, "Tremble, therefore, tyrants of the world, tremble before the virtual writer." Print culture and the French Revolution. Many historians have argued that print culture created the conditions within which French Revolution occurred. Okay. Three types of arguments have been usually put forward. What are those? First, print popularized the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers. Collectively, their writings provided a critical commentary on tradition, superstition, and nepotism. They argued for the rule of reason rather than custom, and demanded that everyone be judged through the application of reason and rationality. They attacked the sacred authority of the church and despotic power of the state, thus enduring the legitimacy of social order based on tradition. The writings of Voltaire and Rousseau were read widely, and those who read the books saw the world through new eyes that were questioning, critical, and rational. Second, print created a new culture of dialogue and debate. All values, norms, and institutions were re-evaluated and discussed by public that had become aware of the power of reason and recognized the need to question the existing ideas and beliefs. Within the public culture, new ideas of social revolution came into being. Third, by the 1780s, there was an outpouring of literature that mocked the royalty and criticized their morality. In the process, it raised questions about the existing social order. Cartoons and caricatures typically suggested that monarchy remained absorbed only in sensual pleasures while the common people suffered immense hardship. This literature circulated underground and led to the growth of hostile sentiments against the monarchy. So this which ultimately influenced the French Revolution. How do we look at these arguments? There can be no doubt that print helps to spread of ideas, but we must remember that people did not read just one kind of literature. If they read the ideas of Voltaire and Rousseau, they were also exposed to monarchical and church propaganda. They were not influenced directly by everything they read and saw. They accepted some ideas and rejected others. They interpreted things their own way. Print did not directly shape their minds, but it did open up the possibility of thinking differently. So print didn't diverted their mind. Okay, it made them think differently. The 19th century. The 19th century saw vast leaps in mass literacy in Europe, bringing in large numbers of readers among children, women, and workers. Children, women, and workers. As primary education became compulsory from the late 19th century, children became an important category of readers. Production of school textbooks became critical for publishing industry. A children's press devoted to literature for children alone was set up in France in 1857. This press published new works as well as old fairy tales and folk tales. The Grimm brothers in Germany spent years compiling traditional folk tales gathered from peasants. What they collected was edited before the stories were published in collection in 1812. Anything that was considered unsuitable for children or would appear vulgar to the elites was not included in the published version. Rural folk tales thus acquired new form. In this way, print recorded old tales but also changed them. Women became important as readers as well as writers. Penny magazines were especially meant for women, as were manuals teaching proper behavior and housekeeping. When novels began to be written in the 19th century, women were seen as an important readers. Some of the best known novelists were women: Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot. Their writings became important in defining a new type of woman, a person with all strength of personality, determination, and power to think. Leading libraries had been in existence from the 17th century onwards. In the 19th century, leading libraries in England became instruments for educating white-collar workers, artisans, and lower middle class people. Sometimes self-educated working class people wrote for themselves. After the working day was gradually shortened from the mid-19th century, workers had some time for self-improvement and self-expression. They wrote political tracts and autobiographies in large numbers. Further innovation. By the late 18th century, the press became to be made out of metal. Through the 19th century, there was a series of further innovations in printing technology. By the mid-19th century, Richard M. Hoe of New York had perfected the power-driven cylindrical press. This was capable of printing This was capable of printing 8,000 sheets per hour. This press was particularly used for printing newspaper. In the late 19th century, the offset press was developed which could print up 6 colors at a time. From the turn of 20th century, electrically operated presses accelerated printing operations. A series of other development followed. Methods of feeding paper improved. The quality of plates became better. Automatic paper reels and photoelectric controls of the color register were introduced. The accumulation of several individual mechanical improvements transformed the appearance of printing text. Printers and publishers continuously developed new strategies to sell their product. 19th century periodicals serialized important novels which gave birth to a particular way of writing novels. In the 1920s, England, popular works were sold in cheap series called shilling series. The dust cover of the book's jacket is also 20th century innovation. With the onset of Great Depression in 1930, publishers feared decline of book purchases. To sustain buying, they bought out cheap paper book editions. Now we will see India in the world of print. Okay. India had very rich and old tradition of handwritten manuscripts in Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, as well as various vernacular languages. Manuscripts were copied on palm leaves or handmade paper. Pages were sometimes beautifully illustrated. They would be either pressed between wooden covers or sewn together to ensure preservation. Manuscript continued to be produced till well after the introduction of print down the late 19th century. So, manuscript, however, were highly expensive and fragile. They had to be handled carefully, and they could not be read easily as the script was written in different styles. So manuscripts were not widely used in everyday life. Even though pre-colonial Bengal had developed an extensive network of village primary schools, students often did not read text. They only learned to write. Teachers dictated portions of text from memory and students wrote them down. Many thus became literate without ever actually reading any kind of text. So till now we are doing till here, and soon we're coming with part 2. Hope you all understood part 1. Okay. For more information and details, please contact the Bodhi Academy.